The sinking of the Titanic, the death of over 1,000 people. Does anyone care that some rich people died? What if they died because some people wanted them dead? Today we're talking about the death of John Jacob Astor. There's some conflicting reports about exactly how much money he had. But at the time of his death, he was one of the richest people in the world. He was born into wealth as the grandson of the guy who founded the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. But he parlayed that initial capital into one of the largest fortunes in the world. He owned a ton of stuff, including half of the Waldorf Astoria, a bunch of vineyards in France, and large swaths of land across the U.S., including the entire state of Delaware. In 1912, he was going to Europe to meet a woman he recently became engaged to. They were apparently getting married when she returned to America. And since he was worth literally hundreds of millions of dollars today, he could afford to charter an entire ship to get him there quickly and comfortably. And that's what he did, sort of. You see, there were two ships available to him, the nearby Olympic and the slightly more distant Titanic. He booked passage on the Titanic and paid for a lavish suite that he planned a honeymoon in. But 2 weeks before the ship was set to leave, he canceled and booked passage on the Olympic instead. But why would someone as rich as John Jacob Astor cancel a cross-Atlantic voyage on the height of his engagement and wealth? Did he have some kind of premonition? Well, according to a conspiracy theory, he got wind that the Titanic was actually a setup. See, the shipping company that owned these boats, the White Star Line, had two almost identical ships, the Olympic and the Titanic. And while they were both very luxurious for the time period, the Titanic was cutting edge, featuring things like a swimming pool and an a la carte dining menu. Also, it turned out, these ships were built with fatal flaws. The rivets holding together the hull of the ship were substandard, which is important. The conspiracy goes that the Olympic had been damaged in a previous voyage and the cost of fixing it was so great that the White Star Line owners wanted to get rid of it. So they switched the nameplates, pocketed the insurance money, and let the Titanic sink. Sounds crazy, right? Well, there are a few problems with that theory. First, the Titanic wasn't fully insured. Only the cargo hold was insured, which means that the White Star Line couldn't recoup even a fraction of what they spent on the ship. Second, there are pictures of the Titanic that show that the ship as hull numbers line up with the Titanic, and not the Olympic. Third, survivors describe the ship that they were on as being older and run down, which matches the description of the Olympic, not the Titanic. But perhaps most importantly, there's no evidence that White Star Line ever considered getting rid of the Olympic. In fact, they were already making plans to launch a third ship that was even more luxurious than the Titanic. If this wasn't an insurance scam, then why did Astor cancel his trip? Well, that's where the conspiracy thickens. You see, around this time, the American financial elite were divided over a proposed plan to create a central bank for the U.S., something that we today take for granted. But back then was a radical idea. J.P. Morgan was a proponent of the plan and had a lot to gain from it. His rival, John Jacob Astor, was not. In fact, only a few months before the sinking of the Titanic, Astor wrote an editorial denouncing the proposed central bank and criticizing Morgan's role in pushing for it. Astor argued that such a bank would give too much power to Wall Street and allow them to control interest rates and the money supply to their own benefit, basically. He predicted that it would lead to a financial oligarchy. Well, J.P. Morgan took this threat very seriously. So seriously that he had his investigators dig up dirt on Astor, even hiring private detectives to follow him and his family around. And all of this was documented in a letter that Morgan's assistant wrote to him detailing Astor's daily activities. But that doesn't mean that Morgan ordered the hit. After all, he didn't even like the guy that much. According to the records, the two men had met only a handful of times prior to Astor's death. Besides, there were plenty of other wealthy anti-Fed people on board the Titanic that night, like Benjamin Guggenheim, the owner of Macy's, and Isidore Straus, the co-owner of R. HMAC. And the fact that Morgan's rivals were also his friends doesn't really comport with the idea that he would have had them killed. In fact, after the sinking, he attended their funerals. So was it an assassination? Well, there are 3 pieces of evidence that make it seem plausible. First, the timing. Too many powerful anti-Fed people died on that ship, not to mention the fact that Morgan himself was scheduled to be on the same boat, but canceled last minute. Second, the cover-up. White Star Line tried to keep the damage to the Olympic a secret, offering large payouts to survivors to keep quiet. Third, Morgan's behavior. He hired private investigators to follow Astor around and frequently clashed with him in public. But without hard evidence, it will never be possible to say for sure. So what happened to John Jacob Astor and the other wealthy passengers on the Titanic? Officially, they died when the ship struck an iceberg and sank. But conspiratorially, they died because someone wanted them dead. As always, be sure to like and subscribe to see more. Thanks for watching.